Well, let me start by first saying thank you for being here. But I wanted to give you an opportunity to ask questions about the report we submitted to the President yesterday. All of you know by now, last December, the President asked me and Lori Robinson, a professor at George Mason University, to co-chair a task force on 21st century policing. He announced the other members of the task force in mid-December. And with the holidays, of course, we didn't get started on this task until January. But we had a deadline of March 2nd to provide to him concrete recommendations on ways in which policing can be improved across the country. We were able to meet that timeline, and yesterday we submitted a final report. Well, actually, it's an interim report to the President on our recommendations concerning policing now and the direction it ought to go in the future. There are a total of 59 recommendations. It is on the COPS website. If you've not read the entire document, you should, because if you just read the recommendations, you don't have context. There's a lot of narrative that really explains the rationale behind the recommendations, and it's worth reading. So with that, let me allow you to ask whatever questions you might have concerning the recommendations or anything else that's in the document itself.
Commissioner, there's a lot of very specific items: demilitarization, body
right.
cameras, federal funding for the racial bias training, that sort of thing. But what is it that's sort of the DNA of changing the culture? The one thing that stood out to me was changing the mindset among the law
right.
enforcement community of getting away from sort of an adversarial or us versus them and getting back to more of the protector, guardian type thing. It seems like that's kind of where it all starts. Everything else is you just treat the symptom.
Well, training and education, one of the pillars and one of the most important pillars, I think, when it comes to changing the culture and the mindset in policing. Now, having said that, it doesn't mean that every police officer has a particular mindset. We're all individuals like everyone else. But the point of that, and Sue Rohr, who is currently in charge of training in Washington State, previously she had been the sheriff in Washington State, the area right around Seattle, Washington, King County, I believe it is the one who really came up with that terminology. In other words, you know, for years we've heard, you know, we're fighting crime, it's a war on crime, war on drugs, war on this, war on that. And we're not at war with the communities that we serve. We have a job to do. We certainly have to arrest people who are committing crimes and so forth. But we also have a larger responsibility, and that's to protect the rights of individuals, to protect people. And that's the guardian mentality. And that's a very important part of this report. And I think it's fundamental to how we need to think about the way in which we train police officers so they see themselves in a larger role in society as defenders of constitutional rights of individuals, as opposed to trying to find ways in which, you know, to deal with certain provisions within the Constitution that they may feel actually get in the way of their ability to do their job. Understand the importance of it.
Of the 59 recommendations, is there one that you look at and say to yourself, there's a big gap between that ideal and what my department is doing right now?
No, I can't think of anything that's really that big a gap. There are some things that obviously we aren't doing, but that doesn't mean that there's not things that we can at least begin to implement. Now, it's not just on us. We're going to have cooperation from others in order to make it a reality. But we were asked to take a look at this from a national perspective, not just an individual city. And we came up with recommendations that we think are best for the profession. There's a lot of work that needs to be done. We've had some conversation just this morning about ways in which now we can get out in our various communities and really work toward implementing this, you know, convincing other departments, unions, and others that this is the direction that policing needs to go. And so there's a lot of work yet to be done.
Commissioner, the independent review process for deputy units, can you talk a little bit about what that would be and how it's come about?
Well, we spent a lot of time talking about that. Obviously, that's a topic of conversation across the country. And the way the language in that particular recommendation reads, any use of force resulting in death, any officer-involved shooting involving injury or death, or any in-custody death. The investigation would be handled separately from the department. Multi-agency task force is what's recommended that would come in and would do the initial investigation. The second part of that, and the recommendation that follows, is one that really encourages district attorneys, state's attorneys, the prosecutorial authority to consider also having someone else review that particular case. Again, it doesn't mean that agencies aren't able to conduct the investigation. It doesn't mean that prosecutors aren't able to review and come to a conclusion. But we do have to deal with perception. We have to deal with the appearance of impropriety in some cases. And in order to deal with that, having a separate review of these cases we thought was important. And again, this task force was made up of not only police chiefs, but we also had civil rights activists, we had community organizers, we had academics, we had a variety of people all lending their voice to this particular issue.
When you look at some of these things are theory versus reality, even the Guardian versus us versus them. Some of these neighborhoods, it's hard not to be us versus them. Some of the places that you guys go. And even, you know, the transparency in investigations, the appearance of an investigation, you know, for the deadly harm. Are there times where you look at some of this stuff and you just kind of throw your hands up and you're just like, I don't even know how we change it?
No, I mean, listen, change isn't easy. I mean, if it was easy, we would have done it already. It's going to take time. It may take generations before some of this actually is fully in place. But when we say things like us versus them, how do we define them? Everyone in these neighborhoods, even our most challenged neighborhoods, everyone's not engaged in criminal activity. Everyone's not engaged in doing something wrong. So who's the them? And when you start to take on that mentality, that's when you start sliding down a very dangerous path and you wind up in trouble. And we need to be able to distinguish between those that are causing harm and take the appropriate action against them, but not let that expand to a point where now we look at an entire community through that same lens, because nothing could be further from the truth. So, you know, even with offenders that we arrest, we still have an obligation to protect their rights and not violate their constitutional rights. I mean, we have to give Miranda warnings. We have to do certain things that the courts have decided, and rightfully so, to be able that we don't infringe upon the rights of those accused of a crime. And so the guardian mentality applies even to those people who are out here in the community causing harm.
Commissioner, with regards to perceptions and transparency, the recent Guardian article exposing the Homan Square facility in Chicago, it's not entirely clear what's happening there, or what has been happening there, but there is clearly a perception in the community that something untoward has been going on. Does the goal of transparency involve, now the Chicago PD has put out, you know, a press release and a series of points about the facility. Does the goal of transparency and changing perceptions need to evolve to include police addressing these perceptions, even when there may not be a factual basis for them, that they are still influencing community opinion, and should there be a more conscientious effort to address that?
Well, I mean, you know, you do the best you can, but if you've got something that is not based on fact, then it becomes very, very difficult. I mean, Homan Square was opened just before I left the Chicago Police Department. There have been numerous press conferences. If you read the media accounts in Chicago, many of the reporters are scratching their heads saying, since when is this an undercover facility? They've been going there for more than a decade for various events. They've gone through tours of the facility and so forth. So that kind of came out of left field. Now, I don't know how you deal with some of that. But I think that where things like that catch fire is when there's this feeling and this general mistrust about policing that exists right now. It's very unfortunate, but we've got to find a way to work through it. So even the most ridiculous statements somehow have some level of credibility only because there's just this mistrust. And I think that's the barrier that we have to break down. So it's going to be difficult. It's going to take time, and it doesn't mean that we'll totally overcome it. But I think we have to start somewhere and continue to provide as much information and be as open to the public as we can without compromising investigations and so forth.
What was the issue with a blanket recommendation for body cameras? I know you guys and other jurisdictions have experimented with them, but what was the problem with making that part and parcel of it?
We had a lot of debate around that, and if you read that one section on technology and social media, the first page of the narrative discusses in great detail the issue of body cameras. Jim Bierman, the executive director of the Police Foundation, gave very compelling testimony, as did others, around the issues around body cameras. When we looked at the role and the job that the president gave us, and the name of the task force is, you know, a task force on 21st century policing, which implies it's not just today, but tomorrow as well. We wanted to take a broader look at technology. Today we're talking about body cameras. Tomorrow we'll be talking about some other form of technology that all of a sudden we find ourselves trying to either buy or put policy in place and so forth. So what are those things that we need to make sure that we take into consideration before we move forward? For an example, what are some of the privacy issues or constitutional issues that are involved? We need to have those discussions up front before we start to put in place certain types of technology. Everybody's crying for body cameras right now. We're experimenting with body cameras. I believe that body cameras will help a great deal. But what happens when in the future manufacturer says, well, let me improve on the technology to make my device more appealing than another. So they add software on it that now has the ability to facial recognition capability. I'm not saying that's right or wrong, but think about the implications that things like that have. Technology advances very, very quickly, and it advances faster than the law and that policy can keep pace with. So we wanted to take an approach that was a lot broader than just dealing with body cameras, although we do spend time talking about it, but to have a recommendation about body cameras makes the report obsolete in just a year, when the conversation is now on whether or not police should be using drones, for an example. Should police be using some other type of technology? So we wanted to keep it a little broader, but certainly no one in that room was not in favor of body cameras, although we need to consider a lot of issues. How long do you hold on to the tape? What kind of editing needs to be done? Because cameras pick up everybody walking down the street. What about those people who had nothing to do with the incident that you're dealing with? The cost of storage, the cost of editing. There's a lot of funding issues that are associated with it as well. And not every state has laws, including Pennsylvania until recently, that would allow for the audio recording portion of the body cameras, because you needed to have two-party consent. And there are still some states that are like that. So there are so many differences when you look at it from a national perspective that we didn't want to focus on one piece of technology. We wanted to keep it much broader. Yes?
I know you have the pilot program for body cameras in the 35th district, and I know you're...
22nd, yeah.
22nd, sorry.
Yeah.
And you've talked about a lot of issues with the business. What kind of issues is the pilot program facing? Are they having to deal with these sort of, privacy issues?
Not that I'm aware of yet, but the biggest issue that we have had is uploading a video. Some of the cameras, quite frankly, weren't sturdy enough for daily use like is needed in policing, although those kinds of issues have constantly come up.
Commissioner, I know you shared this on a national mandate level, but you're still biased to Philadelphia and our local. So what do you want the people of Philadelphia to understand about your approach to this and as a report card, how are we faring?
Well, I don't know if I have a report card grade, but clearly we have our issues in Philadelphia as well as other cities have their issues as well. But we are moving in a positive direction, I think. And, we talk about transparency, but we also have to take in consideration certain limitations that we have in terms of release of information prior to it coming to trial. I mean, we gotta avoid trial by media, trial by the public, all those kinds of things. But we need to have people that at least have enough faith in the system where they're willing to wait for the outcome. And that's the problem right now, not just in Philly, but in elsewhere, is that patience of waiting for the outcome, or if the outcome isn't what people think, then we have problems. Again, it goes back to mistrust. And also opinions are being made about certain cases without all the information you need in order to formulate a real opinion about a particular matter.
Commissioner, are there any recommendations in the report that the Philadelphia Police Department will not adopt? Or whatever?
No.
Maybe they're not.
No. Now, there may be some that's impractical that we will not be able to. For an example, this whole issue of having an independent review of police shootings. We'll have to enter into a memorandum of agreement with another agency or agencies in order to make that happen. So we got to sit down and have some conversation. Okay? So if we can come to some kind of agreement, and obviously there's going to be some, these things happen at 3 in the morning. So if somebody's on overtime, who pays that individual? Certainly their home jurisdiction is going to want to get some kind of reimbursement. So we need to work through some issues. It's not impossible, but it's not going to happen tomorrow. We certainly intend on not only dealing with this particular set of recommendations, but on March the 6th, there's another set of recommendations coming down from the Department of Justice regarding collaborative reform, which I asked them to come in last year, if you recall, to take a look at our policies, our training, everything involving use of force. Now, we have draft copies of that now, but it'll be formally released, I think it's Friday, this Friday, when it's formally released. So all these recommendations at one time, and what we'll do is we'll sort them out. We'll assign people internally to, come up with implementation plans and move forward.
Those recommendations be more along the funding line, because obviously that seems to be all training-based, attitude adjustment, that all those type of things are. Who gets to pay for it?
Well, some has to do with training, but we're already paying for training now. Some of it has to just do with just refocusing the training, taking a look at the current curriculum, making whatever adjustments we need to make. But I think it's fundamental to what we're trying to accomplish. It starts with training. It starts with education, not just of police, but also of community.
One of the things that might be impractical is, among the recommendations, is a hope for residency requirement for police officers. Obviously, there's not been a total residency requirement here for some years. That was given by an arbitrator. Is there any way you can claw that back or get that back from the...
Well, no, and I don't know if it's even something that we would try. Again, this is a national recommendation. There are some agencies that still have residency requirements, some cities. There are some cities that have programs that encourage officers to live within that. So we can't force people where to live, where to raise their families, but we can certainly encourage people to do that. Now, what incentives could be put in place to kind of help that along? That's a separate question and a separate issue, and that I don't know. That goes from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. But is that something that, I live in the city. A lot of officers live inside of Philadelphia. We have a few that live outside of Philadelphia. If you live in Philadelphia, you are living in one of our communities, by default. That may not be the one you work in, but you're still living here. So that's one of the recommendations that we have. We spent a lot of time talking about it. Some people felt very, very strongly about it. I certainly have no objection to having that as a recommendation if it's practical to be able to implement. But no matter what we do, we can't force people to live in a particular area.
Commissioner, as far as transparency goes, I know sometimes the Police Advisory Commission has to subpoena records. They complain about access to documents and that sort of thing, and sometimes it's not released because of an ongoing investigation. What part of that needs to be maybe changed to increase that transparency that's called for?
Yeah, we need to sit down, and I'll sit down with Kelvin Anderson and figure out actually what it is we need to do here at a level. For an example, one of the things that we're in the process of doing is taking a look at our Use of Force Review Board and his role in that. He recently took a look at the information we have on one of the shootings that we're currently investigating in the department. So I certainly want to do all I can to enhance